So I was going to give a quick intro to who we are. Thank you, Winter, for introducing us. Lewes District Council is a cooperative alliance. We're quite a small district council and a planning authority, obviously, but we've got really big ambitions on climate change. Like you, we're really inspired to address both the climate and the nature emergencies. And our local planning system is one of the ways in which we've been trying to do that. It's such an opportunity. I think the other thing I was going to say is that actually we're really stretched for resources. And I think I can probably see Lee, our head of planning, nodding in the background there, because this is one of the real challenges, I think, with trying to do anything through the planning system that I think we just have to put up front there. So what we wanted to do was share what we'd learned through, despite those resource challenges, how we'd managed to take some practical steps. But what I should say is we're not like the biggest, fanciest council who's done the most exciting things on climate change. I have stressed when I was asked to do this talk that actually, well, you know, we've just done the best we can in quite a difficult circumstances. And that was what I was told people wanted to hear, because actually most of us are in that situation with stretched resources, big ideas. But you know, what can you actually do in that circumstance? I was quite interested to know who's in the audience. At one point we were going to run a poll, but I don't think that's possible. But I can see it's mainly quite a mix of planning officers, councillors, people who have a different background, and you know, campaigners. And I suppose what I should say is I'm speaking from a councillor perspective. This is my view. Lee's going to chip in from a head of planning perspective as well. So hopefully, and we're not going to talk too long, so hopefully you can ask those questions that are really specific to your own viewpoint at the end. Can we change the slide, please, Winter? So the start of this story is in 2019. I was elected for the first time as a councillor, and we made a commitment in our corporate plan, as our cooperative alliance, to have the greenest local plan and put sustainability at the heart of our planning system, which is a really big ask. Next slide, please. In fact, as many have found, it's quite hard to do that. Obviously, our local plan is the big overarching document, and it is the gold standard in terms of making real changes in our local planning policy, and it's still where we're going. However, as I'm sure others have found in this situation, local plans take a really long time to happen, and you have to be at the right point in the cycle to influence them. And to make them happen in the way you want to make them happen. So we looked at some other ways that we could think about making some changes with what we have already, really just practical ways that we could do things. And I have to say, this is where Lee and his officers are absolutely fantastic, because instead of saying to me, this is what you can't do, as in you can't have that, they said, this is what you can do. So what their suggestion was to introduce a suite of planning technical advice notes. So those are like little extra documents that sit alongside your other planning policy, things like your local plan. They don't have the same weight as a local plan. Oh, sorry, I just realised I didn't ask you to change the slide, did I? They don't have the weight of a local plan, or there's another kind of document called a supplementary planning document. That's the one, yeah, we're still on there.
Oh, still on, sorry.
Don't worry, you're doing great. So we introduced some technical advice notes. They don't have the weight of a local plan policy or even a supplementary planning document, which is like a fancier version of a technical advice note. But they're much faster to do, which I think is really important. You know, we haven't got all day to sort out climate change, have we? And we need to do what we can as fast as we can. And they also, what I think is really important is they still send that really strong message to developers and people in the planning system about what our expectations are. And they can also be useful because they're going to inform the direction of travel going forward. Can you change the slide, Winter? So a bit about the challenges, resources I've already mentioned. It's quite tricky to do things in a local system when so much stuff is governed nationally. So many of the rules are in the national planning policy framework. And sometimes as a council, it feels a little bit like we're almost a bit stitched up by the national system. We've got this illusion we can do all this stuff locally, but actually the national rules very often trump what we can do. I think some of the language as well in the national planning system really doesn't help. I make a point of every time someone talks about the presumption in favour of sustainable development, which is what kicks in at certain points when you say you haven't got a valid local plan. I just like to call that the presumption in favour of development. Basically, there is a really strong focus on enabling development to happen. And I think the other thing that's a real challenge, and this is particularly one for Lee, is that sort of people like me who are sort of, kind of really wanting to push the boundaries as a councillor and previously as a campaigner, think that the planning system is this absolutely brilliant way to achieve net zero. But then I just sort of get this look from Lee, I think he's given it me now actually, which is when the kind of random councillor says, I want to do this, and they know that you can't, that the system's not going to allow that. And I have to say, it's really hard being a planner. You can't just decide to do things. You can't just make up planning policy on the spot or pass a council motion that says we're going to do X, Y, and Z, because they always have to get that policy past the inspector. Okay, next slide, please. So as I said, my story on this, I was asked to say a little bit about what I'd done before being a councillor, before the last 2 years. So I started out as a campaigner with a Winter. Could you change the slide? And the bit I was particularly asked to talk about was my day job, which is working for one of the UK's leading food partnership. That's Brighton and Hove Food Partnership, where I led a 2-year project working with Brighton and Hove City Council, so not the council where I'm a councillor, on a food and planning project. I think that the things we managed to do through that were the City Council adopted a revised and improved planning advice note on food growing. So it's how you incorporate food growing into new developments. It's a fantastic opportunity, new development, how do we make food growing part of that? And I think the learning from that was about working in partnership. It was developed with the City Council, with their planners, myself in an independent voluntary organisation, and with some consultancy from Sustain, who are the national food and farming organisation. Can I have the next slide, please? The planning advice note is just really sort of some practical guidance about how to actually do it. It's not new policy, as we've said about technical advice notes. They can't make policy, but it helps to enact some of the policy already in the Brighton and Hove plan about incorporating food growing, and gives some really good examples and technical guidance about how to actually do it. So it goes from being a policy that nobody can actually quite work out what to do, to being real. Can I have the next slide? I feel like I'm turning into Chris Whitty. The other bits of that work was to introduce a new health impact assessment checklist. So the City Council was planning to introduce a health impact assessment checklist, which is a document that many planning authorities, particularly larger ones, have, looking at the health impacts. And they incorporated food growing as part of that health impact assessment. So it asks questions like, so it's like a checklist that developers need to do, and it includes things like, it includes all the stuff around food growing for a start, but it's also got some wider stuff, which we were really pleased about. That was a real aim of the project, around things like ensuring access to food shops, so you don't end up with kind of new developments leading to food deserts where there's nowhere to buy your food. Next slide, please. And it built on a sustainability checklist, which had been in place for a number of years and which the Food Partnership had already collaborated on, which had been a really effective tool in helping to encourage people, not force them, but encourage developers to incorporate food growing as part of new development. And the sustainability checklist is actually really handy because people have to fill it in at the beginning of the process, so it sharpens the mind. And we've done one of those in Lewes District as well that I'm about to come on to. Next slide, please. So at Lewes District Council, basically we've introduced four technical advice notes. The first one I was going to talk about is one on circular economy. I'm only going to talk about these really briefly because I've been asked to keep this very brief, but we can take questions after. Next slide, please. It introduces some core principles around the circular economy, just the sensible stuff really, about responsibly sourcing materials, about designing for circularity, so designing with a view that a building might need to change its function in future, so it's adaptable and flexible, and designing out all that kind of waste that can arise through using the building or constructing it. And it's also around managing the waste and in particular, there's quite a big focus on waste management in it. Construction in our area is more than half the waste stream for the county that we're in. So it's 51% of all the waste produced in the county is construction waste. Have the next slide, please. The next one we introduced was on biodiversity net gain, which is obviously really current at the moment. So basically, this was about setting out our expectations as a council. And I saw there was a question in the chat about enforcing. These are technical advice notes. They're not things we can enforce. They're encouragement, their direction of travel. But it was about setting out what we expect for biodiversity net gain in advance of the government's legislation coming in. And obviously, we'll have to revise that when we actually all know what we're doing from government. Next slide. I think I was just going to mention about that. The thing that our residents in particular have really liked is the fact that it sets out some really clear stuff, like the fact that developers can't just clear a space and then use that as the baseline for their measuring their biodiversity before they add on, their 10% or 20% they need to get to. So it just sets out really clearly it's not okay to clear land and then say that's the biodiversity value. We will backdate to what it used to be. And obviously, if we're kind of estimating what that is, we might be estimating on the high side. So it's not in your interest to randomly clear land. I know that's not quite about carbon, but it's just something that so many people have been frustrated by. I just wanted to mention that. Next slide, please, Winter. The next one, the third of these, is a sustainability and development general principles technical advice note, and the bulk of that is around a checklist. So I mentioned at the beginning how successful that had been. I'd found that in my previous work that I'd done in my day job, but we've now got one for Lewes District Council, and this is basically a checklist that developers fill in at the validation stage, which covers all aspects. It's actually quite long. Some of them really aren't that happy about it, I have to say. Although we have worked with them very closely to try to make them not too unhappy, and Lee's done an amazing job with that and listening to their feedback, which is obviously important. We can't just invent these things. They've got to work for the people using them. But it covers all aspects, everything from sort of drainage to the things we've already talked about, and it brings together the two that we've already mentioned that we've newly introduced around circular economy and biodiversity net gain. For the next slide, please. And then I was just going to mention this, it's not quite so relevant from a climate change perspective, but it does really fit into this kind of wider vision about what our sustainable future looks like, which is a pilot for one area of our district around local employment and training. So it asks developers to include local apprenticeships, local training, and to support local jobs as part of both their construction, and then how their business uses if it is a commercial development, which this is kind of aimed at, how that's used after. Next slide, please. There's a few more things as well. I don't know. So I'll just quickly mention there's a SUDS tool. I don't know if you want to just explain that really quickly, Lee, what SUDS is and how the tool works.
Yeah, thanks for that, Councillor. Yes, we've adopted a local development scheme that has the ambition of our emerging local plan, like the rest of the nation, will be end of 2023. In the councillor's eyes, that was too far away. So we had to work very closely with our development community and our residential community to develop these technical advice notes. They are part of our local validation list, so that they are a key validation criteria, which does mean that we are pushing the consideration of these issues to the forefront. What we were finding before these technical advice notes were embedded into our process was that we were trying to control them either through the life of the application or even worse, by condition. By condition meant that the can was being kicked down the road, and more importantly, it was creating extra work for us when the condition discharge was submitted. So the development of the SUDS tool, Sustainable Drainage Tool, in collaboration with our county council colleagues, does look at a free bit of software, free to use bit of software for our development colleagues, and it does a cubic capacity requirement of your development in terms of how to mitigate surface water disposal. So the scheme has to design the mitigation at validation stage to show that they have addressed that issue. Moving forward, the other issues in terms of, we wanted to reprofile our assessment in terms of the planning committee's understanding of these very important key issues. When we as planning practitioners often assess an application, we often use a lot of shorthand reporting to planning committee. We do the assessment in depth, but when we come to craft our reports, shorthand is often used. And what we've found was that our colleagues on planning committee perhaps weren't given due consideration, due weight to those issues. So we had to reprofile our committee reports to elevate the importance of these key subjects in that. Collectively, as an organisation, we've developed what we've called the Green Consultancy. We've recently employed a cohort of ecologists and sustainability officers, air quality officers, who are sitting in a consultancy with a series of skill sets that we are not only able to dip in internally, but sell out to our neighbouring authorities and or developers who wish to engage in that expertise. Because we do find, and we have found, that experts in fields of these disciplines are quite hard to source locally, and it helps to support our circular economy if we can keep the money circulating locally. And as Councillor says, one of the biggest challenges we've had is convincing our development partners that this is an important thing to do. So we've had a series of engagement sessions where we've had a lot of kickback from the developers about, why do we have to produce these reports that, one, nobody reads, and two, nobody understands. Well, we've had to educate them that, yes, we do read them all, we do understand them all, and where we need specialist input, we would go out and source that specialist input. The important thing is it does elevate it to the very early in the process. So we're asking the scheme designers to think about the place shaping arena rather than leaving it till a conversation later down the track. Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks, Lee. That's brilliant. And I think I'd just like to say, how important it is that Lee and his team are on board with this. I have actually known, like, a head of planning have a bit of technical advice notes sitting in a drawer, literally under their desk, because it's actually one that they don't really feel is right and isn't isn't going to work for developers or for themselves to implement. So they sort of keep it in a drawer. And what we want is advice notes that are used as part of the assessment of applications. They come out, people are asked to look at them. And that's partly why we're a big fan of the sustainability checklist approach, because it puts that conversation happening between the planners and the developers at the beginning of the process. And Lee's just been such a champion around putting these agendas onto developers' radars. I just think it's been fantastic the way that they've done that. Okay, I'm going to just speed through because I'm just about to run out of time. So I was asked to say a bit about who needs to be on board. Obviously, as I've said, we needed to ensure that our developers and planning agents were taken with us on the journey. We have a planning agents forum, which we took these through. They were quite critical, I have to say. They weren't very happy. So there's some of them, there is a tension there, I think we have to acknowledge, between making their life easy and challenging them on sustainability. And we've done our best to navigate that. But what we have done is make changes in response to their feedback, for instance, making some things not apply to smaller schemes in the same way. The other people who need to be on board are our planners. As I said, there's absolutely no point in having something that sits on in a drawer, and that's, so we need our policy team who develop these things, develop the policies and the advice notes, but also the development management team, the DM team, and they're the people who assess the applications and use the stuff. There's no point if it doesn't work for them, it's got to work for them. It also needs me on board. So part of I started out by saying that, I needed to learn to think like a planner, and that's been quite a journey for me over the last few years with wearing different roles. There is absolutely no point in me saying to Lee, right, I want every home that's built in the district to be zero carbon, because Lee will just give me that look that planners give you when you're asking for something that they just can't do. They wouldn't be able to get that past an inspector. So I hope we've built up a good understanding and a sort of trust relationship that I'm not going to ask for the impossible, although we constantly challenge each other, I think it's fair to say, in that conversation. We've also needed partner input. So for instance, biodiversity net gain guidance obviously need partners like Sussex Wildlife Trust to input into that. And for the local employment guidance as well, we also needed employers as well as the construction companies to be on board. Can I have the next slide? And then I was also asked to just think a little bit about what's the added value of using our planning system, but also taking this kind of approach about doing practical steps. Planning is obviously a huge opportunity, not only around carbon reduction, but also for biodiversity. We just don't have time, do we, to look at these things separately. And there's some real opportunities at the moment around doing biodiversity net gain well. We could talk about that after if people are interested, if there's questions. The other opportunity is obviously health and wellbeing, and I was going to put in a little plug here for the Town and Country Planning Association. They're running a Healthy Homes campaign that includes things like a template motion you can put to your council around adopting the Healthy Homes principles, which is something we did in the summer. They're framed around health and wellbeing, but obviously actually part of health and wellbeing is health and wellbeing of our planet. So they're also really great on climate change and wider sustainability issues. And I think the other gain is around, or the other added value is around our economy. We as an administration have a commitment to a community wealth building approach, so a circular economy and an economy that recycles wealth within our own area. And obviously these technical guidance notes on circular economy, and also especially the local employment one as well, are really important for helping to deliver that. Next slide. So I was just going to say thank you for listening. I have got some links I can put in the chat as well. I know a couple of people were asking for links, and I'm also hoping that somebody else has been checking the questions. So over back to you, Winter. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you. That was really fantastic. Kind of broad overview of what is quite a lot of work that's happening across the council. Now, I just need just a second so I can get up to speed myself with the questions we've had through. So one moment.
I'm putting some of those links in the chat, Winter, because you very kindly shared the presentation for me because I broke the system. So I know you haven't been able to monitor the questions.
No worries at all. So what I would like to do is to see if any of the delegates who've posted questions would like to come on screen to ask the questions themselves, so we can have actually a little bit of a discussion going. So what I'd like to do is look at perhaps one of the first questions we had through, if possible. So we've kind of covered that one from Ben, unless Ben, you'd like some more detail from the speakers on that one. So I might pop over to.
Do you want me to answer one that's just come through in the chat really quickly, Winter? Because I can answer that really quickly, which is Dave's question. He's just popped in just while you look at and sort the earlier ones. Just because I meant to mention, Dave, thank you for your question, that yes, part of the reason for doing these technical advice notes is that they then set the direction of travel and provide learning and feedback and evidence, which is so important for local plan policies. So for instance, if our our pilot scheme around using local employment, if that proves effective, we can then make that a local plan policy going forward. But also I think the sustainability ones, it sets a direction of travel and will provide feedback that we can make that approach work locally, which will help us to strengthen them. Thanks for that.
I think, as Councillor says, that these technical advice notes are a stopgap, a stepping stone into the formal policy is the local plan. So we've got the window between now and December 2023 when a local plan is in place, and we once that local plan is in place, the technical advice notes will fall away because they will be rolled forward into the formal document that is a new local plan. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you both. I'd like to ask Hazel if you would like to request to share your screen, or you can post in the chat if you don't want to, and that's fine, and I can just read your question out for you, but I thought it might be interesting for you to come on screen and ask your question. I'll give you a minute. think it's just more fun if we have a bit of a dialogue going there. So, right, well, I might get the ball rolling and then you can join if you like. So the question we had through was, have you included any kind of local new build standard that goes beyond building regs? For example, passive house, or anything on public transport access instead of building new roads, for example, new garden village. Who'd like to field that one?
Shall I start with the council perspective on that and then you come in, Lee? So just to say, those things are planning policies, so they are absolutely the aspiration for our next local plan, which we want to have this like greenest local plan brackets in the UK, or brackets that we can get past a government inspector. So they are absolutely part of that. We've included in our consultation for our next local plan things like a 15-minute neighbourhood approach, but for rural areas, which currently, you know, that's something that's happening in city planning policy, but it's quite unusual for rural areas. Those questions are on the table, waiting for the feedback from our communities, and also the kind of evidence base that we need to be able to get them past an inspector, and including the most stringent building standards. But at the moment, these are technical advice notes, so they can only build on the policies we or the government already have in place in the government rulebook or the National Planning Policy Framework, or in our current local plan. So they don't have those kind of really strict ones. They're much more a nudge approach with a view to moving that on. Having said that, it's an awful lot easier to do that. We're sitting here 2 years in, and we've got those sort of adopted and in use, and our local plan is, you know, at an early stage consultation. So there's it doesn't have the power of those real policies, but it does have, but it is something you can be doing now. Do you want to come in on that, Lee? You better give a proper planner's answer, because that was a real councillor answer, I think.
But I think that covers the main thrust. What we have the aim to do through the local plan making is to develop healthy and vibrant neighbourhoods, and that in a rural context is and can be quite challenging, especially, you know, if we are looking to develop the 15-20 minute communities, where we know that a lot of rural communities have lost their infrastructure over time, whether the village shop, the village pub, etc. Public transport not under our control is being, you know, reduced, so the network is being reduced away from these rural settlements. So how do we make that step change to try and enliven, recreate those communities, give them back the heart that they desire? And yes, it is challenging. New settlements is an issue. New settlements to some degree look after themselves if they are of a size where they can look after themselves in terms of employment, education, health, etc. So part of the new local plan will be exploring the potential positively and negatively of that option. We are looking at 6 development themes through our emerging local plan, new settlement being one, dispersed growth being another, and, you know, we've got 4 others that is a blend of those 2. So we have the ambition on the back of the councillors' wider ambition to support the place shaping that does develop healthy, vibrant neighbourhoods. Thank you.
Brilliant. So I guess it's a bit of watch this space and sort of see, you know, this foundation that you're building with these technical advice notes, how that kind of sets you up for that plan, I suppose. I've got another question that I'd like to read out, and welcome Sandra. If you'd like to request to come on screen and have a chat, you can, but I'll read out your question to sort of get the ball rolling as I did before. So I've got a question on how do you balance ensuring you have enough capacity from the Green Consultancy team versus needing to sell this service to help fund it. And she's commented there that it's an interesting approach as many councils can't afford own ecologists.
Can I do it? Can I start firstly again? Sorry, I'm doing. This is definitely a councillor's perspective on this, isn't it? But just to say, so the Green Consultancy is quite new. It's only just in post. I'm really excited about it though, because there's a lot of evidence that for biodiversity net gain in particular, and how you actually implement that, how you actually assess biodiversity and whether the 10% is real or not. There's overwhelming evidence that having an in-house ecologist does so much better a job than farming that out to someone else. So I'm really pleased that we've got that service in-house. I think it's started in quite a small way. You know, we're a small council. As I said, we're really strapped for cash like most councils. So we've only got a couple of ecologists in at the minute. They're going to be largely focused on delivering our wider climate change aspirations. So we have a whole programme. Obviously, I'm just talking about a little bit of planning, but we have a whole climate action plan with, you know, some fantastic stuff going on. So they'll need to work on that. They'll need to do the biodiversity net gain stuff for us and make it work. But the idea is to have a model where we don't outsource that, but we offer that to other people. I mean, hopefully our neighbours, because I'm not keen on us running a kind of green consultancy business that means that someone else is offshoring their requests, you know, to somewhere miles from their own area. But there's definitely a demand for that kind of knowledge, and it's something we're all going to have to do when biodiversity net gain comes in. We are all going to have to assess that. We're going to have to know the DEFRA metric, which is the thing you do at the beginning to work out whether there's 10% more or not, and we're going to have to be using that. And we're also going to have to working out how we make use of things like developer credits, which is when they can't deliver it on site and they have to do it off site. We need to make sure there's a pipeline of things that actually are meaningful that will deliver on climate change and biodiversity. So personally, I'm just really excited about that, but it is really early days. So we don't know yet about capacity. The idea is to start and build. If, you know, hopefully we can recruit more if we need them. Anyway, sorry, that was definitely the councillor answer. Lee, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks. One of the questions in the chat was around how do we monitor these initiatives, and the Green Consultancy is the specialist arm of that monitoring. If we were to ask, you know, a traditional planning enforcement officer to go out and tell me whether they complied with their biodiversity net gain, well, they wouldn't understand what they were looking at. So this is the ambition that we can have in-house expertise that we can trust. That we don't have to go out and get the report verified by, you know, another ecologist. So we've got that trust built in-house, and as the councillor says, we will be looking to sell that knowledge outside. One of the key things for us at the moment is nature for health. Health and wellbeing, as the councillor says, is very, very important. You know, during the pandemic, post-pandemic, health and open space access, active travel, is becoming more and more important in the planning process, and that Green Consultancy will help us deliver our ambitions for nature and well-being on the health perspective. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So I guess in response to that question, in a way, it sort of sells itself, or we hope that it will sell itself, that Green Consultancy team. I missed one question, which I think is quite important as well. So that's from Bridget, which is sort of twofold. So do these technical advice notes only apply to developments of a certain size or all applications? And have your planning committee had any specific additional training that others could use?
I'm going to let Lee go first on that one.
The answer is yes, education is important. So we have had to inform, update, upskill those that make the decisions on these important place shaping applications, because it's not me at delegated level, it's planning committee that making these decisions. So we have to make sure that they are understanding the issues that we are putting before them, because it is a different hat that they're wearing. They're still deciding applications, but those applications may have a different appearance, different value than they formerly did. And it's making sure that in the balance of material considerations, that they do elevate this as an important issue in their consideration. In terms of how do we apply it in terms of the scale of development, they primarily are majors and above. Why do we have that threshold? Well, one, it's quite easy to administer. It's a national criteria major application. And we recognise that there is a burden on the developer to produce new quantum of evidence behind their application. And at the level of major application above, it's probably more likely to happen. Having said that, though, the technical advice note does give guidance down to householder level on biodiversity, on the drainage, sustainable drainage issues. So we haven't ignored the smaller scale, because incrementally they can have as big an impact as a major application. So we're trying to do both through the technical advice notes.
Great, thank you. Sort of connected to that, where you mentioned you've got the onus on developers to sort of provide this additional evidence, and then requiring those skills and knowledge to sort of do that. We've got a question from Emma here, which is understanding that the primary aim is to disincentivize site clearance prior to application. How would you approach estimating the biodiversity value of a site that has already been cleared? Is there sort of a simple answer to that, or?
I don't think there is. I'm gonna, Lee, have you got an answer to that? I mean, it is really tricky, basically, and having an in-house ecologist, I think, is a good first step. I mean, for me, actually, part of these things are not, some of the stuff in them is going to be quite hard to enforce if we're really clear about it. I mean, hopefully not that particular bit, but the other thing that they do, as well as being an enforcement tool, they're actually about sending the message in the first place, don't do it. I'm hoping that they will, it's as much, one big gain is to disincentivize that and to tell our residents that that's our policy. So, because they're often our eyes and ears around some of this stuff going on. Lee, have you got a more technical answer on that?
No, I think you covered it. Thank you.
Great. And I'll just sort of try and cover off a couple more before we hit quarter past. So just sort of, I guess, a technical question again. So who do the planning inspectors actually work for? Who sets the rules that they implement? So
they're the government. It's the government planning inspector. So we have to put planning policies through inspection, including our local plan. And just to pick up Dave's point in the chat, I didn't mean to imply that we were in any way going to be unambitious. We're going to push for the highest standards we can. But Lee's job is to be able to put together a plan that will get past an inspector, because if we fail at inspection, then we don't have a plan at all. So we lose that bit of local control. So that's the bit what I was talking about the look that planners give you when you just say, I want everything to be zero carbon with all the affordable housing. And they, the reality is we can't always have everything. Can I just pick up a question in the chat, Winter? I think it's really important. We've only got a couple of minutes, haven't we? But it was just somebody asked about resident engagement and whether the focus on sustainability is helping with getting residents on board. And I have to say, I think that's a real challenge. So we've got questions, in our local plan consultation around, how, do you support zero carbon homes? Do you support all this great stuff? But actually the thing people are really focused on in areas like ours in the southeast with really high housing numbers to try to achieve and no brownfield sites really left, very limited space for development, is about the new settlement thing. So, a lot of the noise around our local plan consultation is around people saying we don't want development in our neighbourhood. Most people are quite in favour of the idea of new settlement, but just not if it's next to them, understandably. So I think it plays a part. I think it sets out our stall that we're serious about this stuff and that we put the planet and communities at the heart. And I think we've gained some trust with our communities. But I think the bigger issue is about the fear of development. It doesn't, kind of cut across that, and it's actually been really nice to talk about all the good stuff going on and not to be in a conversation about housing numbers and what's coming in our land availability assessment, in our call for sites that could be on the table for for future growth. So I do think it's really tricky.
Just building on that, from a planning application point of view, when developers come into us now, they used to say, you haven't got a 5-year housing land supply. Aren't we good as developers coming in to help you meet that housing shortfall by giving you 100 houses? What they're saying to us now is, look at the place shaping, look at the community woodland, look at the growing space, look at the SUDS development, look at the active travel. Oh, and by the way, here's 100 houses. So they've elevated their understanding in terms of their thinking, their thought processes before coming to see us. Yes, it's still 100 houses, but it's a far better scheme as a result of these initiatives that we've rolled out. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess that there's the core part of that is then communicating that to residents and having them come along with that, those changes. I think we're going to have to wrap it up now, although there is plenty more brilliant questions in the chat. which we'd love for you to keep the conversations going. So please do jump over into networking, which is what we've got next. Is a little bit of, I think it's 15-minute break where you can pop in there and have a chat, or you can directly message people if you think you'd like to start a conversation with them. But thanks very much for joining us today, Lee and Councillor. It's been fantastic. Yeah, I wish we had an hour more, or longer than that even, to cover off some of these topics that we've touched on in more detail. And thank you for everyone who's joined us. Yeah, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions that you visit today. And if you want to leave, you just jump on that leave button in the top right-hand corner.
Amazing. Thanks, Windsor. Thanks, everyone. Really great questions. Thanks, Lee. Bye.
Bye.